Maria Santos stared at the computer screen, her heart sinking as she read the classification next to her name. Non-essential personnel. The words felt like a punch to the stomach. After 3 years of working as a data analyst for the 42nd Tactical Squadron, she was being labeled as expendable during the latest military restructuring. The fluorescent lights in the cramped office buzzed overhead as Maria watched her colleagues pack their desks around her. Some had received promotions, others transfers to better positions, but she remained stuck in the same corner cubicle where she had spent countless hours analyzing flight patterns and mission data. Her supervisor, Colonel Harrison, barely acknowledged her presence anymore, treating her like furniture that came with the building. Maria had always been different from her colleagues. While they focused on the big picture strategies and high-profile missions, she found herself drawn to the small details that others overlooked. She noticed patterns in seemingly random data, connections that escaped even the most experienced analysts. But in a world that valued bold action and quick decisions, her methodical approach was often dismissed as overthinking. The squadron was preparing for their most important deployment yet. Operation Desert Wind would take them deep into hostile territory, where intelligence suggested enemy forces were planning a major offensive. The mission required perfect coordination between multiple aircraft, and every piece of data had to be absolutely accurate. Lives depended on it. As Maria sat alone in the office that evening, she continued working on what everyone else considered routine maintenance of the flight vector database. These vectors contained the precise flight paths, altitude adjustments, and timing sequences that pilots would follow during the mission. Most people saw it as boring administrative work, but Maria understood that these numbers represented the difference between life and death for every person in those aircraft. She had been working with flight vectors for so long that she could spot anomalies almost instinctively. Tonight something felt wrong. The numbers looked correct on the surface, but there was a subtle pattern that made her uncomfortable. The mathematical relationships between different flight paths seemed slightly off, like a musical chord that was almost in tune but not quite right. Her colleagues had already gone home to prepare for the deployment. The base was quiet except for the distant sound of aircraft engines being tested. Maria knew she should probably leave too, but something kept her glued to her computer screen. Years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts, even when she couldn't immediately explain what was bothering her. The mission briefing had emphasized speed and efficiency. The squadron would fly in tight formation through a narrow corridor between two mountain ranges, timing their approach to avoid enemy radar detection. Everything had to happen within a precise window of opportunity. If they were even a few seconds off schedule, the entire operation could fail. Maria pulled up the vector calculations one more time, running through each sequence step by step. The flight paths had been approved by 3 different departments and reviewed by the most senior analysts on the base. Everyone agreed they were perfect, but as she traced the routes with her finger on the screen, she felt that familiar nagging sensation that told her something was wrong. She had experienced this feeling before, usually just before discovering a critical error that everyone else had missed. Her attention to detail had occasionally saved missions from minor problems, but those incidents had been quietly resolved without much fanfare. This time felt different, though. The stakes were higher, and the potential consequences of a mistake would be devastating. As midnight approached, Maria made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going home and trusting that smarter people than her had already checked everything thoroughly, she decided to dig deeper into the vector calculations. She opened up the raw data files and began analyzing every single coordinate, altitude marker, and timing sequence with the methodical precision that had made her colleagues consider her slow and overly cautious. What she discovered in those late-night hours would prove that sometimes being labeled non-essential meant you were free to see things that everyone else was too busy or too important to notice. The discovery came at 2:47 a.m., when Maria's tired eyes finally caught what had been hiding in plain sight. Deep within the vector calculations, she found a systematic error that had been replicated across multiple flight paths. The mistake was subtle, involving a coordinate conversion that was off by just a few degrees. To most people, it would have seemed insignificant, but Maria understood the mathematics well enough to realize what this small error would cause. The flight paths that looked perfectly safe on paper would actually guide the squadron directly into a mountain face. The error had been introduced during the conversion from the old navigation system to the new GPS coordinates, and somehow it had slipped past every review process. The pilots would follow their instruments faithfully, believing they were flying through a safe corridor, only to discover too late that they were headed straight for solid rock. Maria's hands trembled as she ran the calculations again and again, hoping she had made a mistake. But the numbers didn't lie. If the squadron followed these vectors exactly as planned, all 12 aircraft would crash into the mountainside within seconds of each other. The mission would end in complete disaster, with no survivors. She immediately tried calling Colonel Harrison, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The other senior officers were either unreachable or had already left for the forward operating base where the mission would launch at dawn. Maria realized with growing panic that she might be the only person on the entire base who knew about the deadly error in the flight plans. The weight of responsibility felt crushing. Here she was, someone who had been officially labeled as non-essential, holding information that could save the lives of 62 highly trained pilots and crew members. But who would listen to her? She had no authority to halt a major military operation, and her track record of questioning details had often been dismissed as neurotic perfectionism. Maria spent the next hour trying to reach anyone who might have the power to delay the mission. She called every number she could find, leaving urgent messages that probably sounded hysterical to anyone who heard them. The base's night duty officer listened politely, but explained that he couldn't authorize any changes to approved flight plans without direct orders from his superiors. Time was running out. The squadron was scheduled to take off in less than 4 hours, and once they were in the air, it would be too late to warn them about the vector error. Even if she could reach them by radio, they would be flying through radio silence protocols in enemy territory. The pilots would have no choice but to trust their instruments and follow the programmed flight paths. Desperate and exhausted, Maria made a decision that could end her career, but might save dozens of lives. She accessed the main flight computer system and began manually correcting the vector coordinates. She had no authorization to make these changes, and tampering with mission-critical data was a serious breach of protocol that could result in court-martial proceedings. As she worked, Maria documented every change she made, creating a detailed report that explained the error and showed her calculations. She knew that if she was wrong, she would face severe consequences for sabotaging a military operation. But if she was right, her unauthorized actions might be the only thing standing between the squadron and a catastrophic disaster. The corrected flight paths would take the aircraft safely through the mountain corridor, adding only a few extra minutes to their flight time while keeping them well clear of any obstacles. The changes were subtle enough that the pilots probably wouldn't even notice the difference, but they were crucial for survival. By dawn, Maria had completed the vector corrections and printed copies of her analysis. She drove to the airfield just as the pilots were completing their final briefings, clutching the papers that contained proof of her discovery. The squadron was already preparing to board their aircraft when she arrived at the operations center. Colonel Harrison emerged from the briefing room, looking surprised and annoyed to see her there. Before he could speak, Maria thrust the documentation into his hands and began explaining the vector error as quickly and clearly as she could. She watched his expression change from irritation to confusion, to growing alarm as he realized the implications of what she had found. Colonel Harrison's face went pale as he studied Maria's calculations. The mathematics were undeniable, but the implications were staggering. The entire mission planning team had missed an error that would have killed everyone involved in the operation. He immediately ordered a halt to the takeoff sequence and called an emergency meeting with the senior staff. Within minutes, the squadron's leadership was gathered around a conference table, examining Maria's findings with a mixture of disbelief and horror. The chief navigation officer initially dismissed her concerns, insisting that the flight paths had been triple-checked and approved by experts. But as they worked through her calculations step by step, the reality became impossible to ignore. The error had originated from a software update to the navigation system 3 weeks earlier. During the conversion process, a single line of code had introduced a systematic bias into the coordinate calculations. The mistake was so subtle that it only became apparent when someone analyzed the complete flight sequence from beginning to end, which was exactly what Maria had done during her late-night investigation. Major Reynolds, The squadron leader stared at the corrected flight paths with a grim expression. He was a veteran pilot with over 15 years of combat experience, and he understood better than anyone how close they had come to disaster. If Maria hadn't caught the error, he and his entire squadron would have flown straight into the mountainside, believing until the last second that they were following a safe route. The delayed takeoff created a cascade of complications. The mission had been timed to coincide with specific intelligence about enemy movements, and the window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Every minute they spent on the ground reduced their chances of success and increased the risk to other Allied forces who were counting on their support. While the senior officers debated whether to proceed with the corrected vectors or abort the mission entirely, Maria found herself at the center of attention for the first time in her career. Pilots and crew members who had never spoken to her before now approached with gratitude and amazement. She had literally saved their lives and they knew it. The pressure to make a decision was intense. The corrected flight paths would work, but they had been hastily calculated by someone who wasn't even supposed to have access to the mission planning systems. Could they trust their lives to modifications made by an analyst who had technically violated security protocols to create them? Captain Williams, one of the younger pilots, spoke up during the heated discussion. He had worked with Maria on several previous missions and had always been impressed by her attention to detail. He vouched for her competence and argued that her track record of catching small but important errors made her exactly the right person to have discovered this problem. After 30 minutes of debate, Colonel Harrison made the call. The mission would proceed using Maria's corrected vectors. The delay had cost them their optimal timing, but intelligence suggested they could still achieve their objectives if they moved quickly. The pilots began updating their navigation systems with the new flight paths. As the aircraft finally began taxiing toward the runway, Maria stood in the operations center watching the squadron prepare for takeoff. She felt a mixture of relief and anxiety, knowing that she had prevented a catastrophe but also understanding that the success of the mission now depended partly on her calculations. If she had made any mistakes in her corrections, the consequences could still be severe. The first aircraft lifted off just as the sun reached its peak in the sky. Maria watched each plane disappear into the distance, carrying pilots whose lives she had helped save. The irony wasn't lost on her that someone classified as non-essential had proven to be absolutely crucial when it mattered most. Colonel Harrison approached her as the last aircraft departed. For the first time since she had known him, he looked at her with something resembling respect. He thanked her for her diligence and admitted that the military's classification system had clearly failed to recognize her true value to the organization. But the mission wasn't over yet. The squadron still had to navigate through enemy territory, complete their objectives, and return home safely. Maria's corrected vectors would guide them through the mountain corridor, but there were many other dangers ahead. All they could do now was wait and hope that her calculations were accurate. The next 6 hours were the longest of Maria's life. She remained in the operations center, monitoring radio communications and tracking the squadron's progress through the mission timeline. The aircraft had successfully navigated through the mountain corridor using her corrected vectors, confirming that her calculations had been accurate. But now they faced an entirely different set of challenges in enemy territory. Radio silence protocols meant that communication was limited to essential updates only. The squadron reported reaching their first checkpoint on schedule, then proceeded toward their primary target. Maria found herself analyzing every piece of incoming data, looking for signs that something might be going wrong. Her experience had taught her that military operations rarely went exactly according to plan. At 14:30 hours, the first indication of trouble came through encrypted communications. The squadron had encountered unexpected enemy air defenses that weren't present in the intelligence briefings. Surface-to-air missiles were being fired from positions that weren't supposed to exist, forcing the aircraft to deviate from their planned routes and take evasive action. Major Reynolds quickly adapted to the changing situation, but the evasive maneuvers had scattered the formation and disrupted their timing. Several aircraft reported damage from near-miss explosions, and one plane was leaking fuel at a dangerous rate. The mission was rapidly becoming more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Maria realized that the squadron would need new vector calculations to safely navigate their return journey. The original route back through the mountains was no longer viable because the damaged aircraft couldn't maintain the required altitude for the planned flight path. They needed an alternative route that would accommodate their reduced capabilities while still avoiding enemy detection. Without waiting for orders, Maria began calculating emergency vector alternatives. She analyzed topographical data, weather, conditions, and known enemy positions to identify possible escape routes. The work required intense concentration and precise mathematics, but she had done similar calculations countless times before. The challenge was finding a path that would work for all the aircraft, including the damaged ones. The fuel leak meant that one plane had a limited range, while battle damage to flight controls meant another couldn't climb above certain altitudes. Maria had to factor in multiple constraints while still ensuring the route was safe and tactically sound. As she worked, Maria could hear the tension in the radio communications from the squadron. They were taking fire from ground positions and needed to escape the area quickly. The longer they remained in enemy airspace, the greater the risk of additional casualties or complete mission failure. Colonel Harrison noticed what Maria was doing and initially started to object. Emergency flight planning was supposed to be handled by senior navigators, not data analysts. But when he saw the quality of her calculations and realized how quickly she was producing viable alternatives, he decided to let her continue. Maria completed 3 different escape route options within 20 minutes. Each route had different advantages and risks, depending on the current status of the aircraft and enemy positions. She prepared detailed briefings for each option, including fuel requirements, timing sequences, and communication protocols. The information was immediately transmitted to Major Reynolds, who was leading the squadron through increasingly dangerous airspace. He reviewed the options while dodging enemy fire and making split-second tactical decisions. The alternative routes that Maria had calculated offered possibilities that his crew hadn't considered, including a low-altitude approach through a valley that would provide cover from radar detection. Major Reynolds chose the second route option, which would take the squadron through a series of mountain passes before emerging into friendly airspace. The path was longer than the original plan, but it avoided most of the enemy defenses and accommodated the limitations of the damaged aircraft. As the squadron began following Maria's emergency vectors, she continued monitoring their progress and making real-time adjustments based on changing conditions. When weather reports indicated unexpected wind patterns in the mountain passes, she recalculated the timing sequences to ensure the aircraft wouldn't be caught in dangerous turbulence. The radio finally crackled with the news everyone had been waiting for. The squadron had successfully cleared enemy airspace and was heading home. All aircraft were accounted for, and while several had sustained damage, there were no casualties. The mission objectives had been achieved, and the pilots were safely returning to base. The aircraft began landing just as the sun was setting, their engines roaring as they touched down one by one on the runway. Maria watched from the operations center as pilots and crew members emerged from their planes, many of them showing signs of the stress and intensity they had endured during the mission. Some aircraft bore visible scars from their encounters with enemy fire, but everyone had made it home alive. Captain Williams was among the first to seek out Maria after the debriefing. He shook her hand with genuine emotion, explaining how her emergency route calculations had quite literally saved his life. His aircraft had been the one with the fuel leak, and the original return path would have left him stranded in enemy territory. The alternative route she had calculated had brought him home with just minutes of fuel remaining. Word of Maria's contributions spread quickly through the squadron. Pilots and crew members who had never paid attention to her before now understood that the quiet analyst in the corner cubicle had been responsible for their survival. The story of how she had discovered the vector error and then provided life-saving emergency navigation became legendary within hours. Major Reynolds personally thanked Maria for her work, acknowledging that without her intervention, the entire squadron would have been lost before the mission even began. He admitted that he had initially been skeptical about trusting such critical calculations to someone outside the normal chain of command, but her accuracy and quick thinking had proven invaluable. The investigation into the original vector error revealed systemic problems with the navigation software update process. The mistake that Maria had caught could have affected multiple future missions, potentially causing disasters throughout the entire Air Force. Her discovery had not only saved one squadron, but had prevented a much larger catastrophe. Colonel Harrison called Maria into his office the next morning. The conversation was awkward at first, as he struggled to reconcile her non-essential classification with the reality of her crucial contribution to the mission's success. He apologized for underestimating her abilities and admitted that the military's bureaucratic system sometimes failed to recognize true talent. Maria learned that her unauthorized access to the flight computer systems could have resulted in serious disciplinary action under normal circumstances. However, given that her actions had prevented a major disaster and saved dozens of lives, the investigation was being dropped. Instead, she was being recommended for commendation and immediate reclassification. The news media eventually picked up the story, though many of the operational details remained classified. Maria found herself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as an example of how attention to detail and dedication to duty could make the difference between life and death. She was uncomfortable with the attention, but understood that her story might inspire other people who felt overlooked or undervalued. Letters began arriving from other military personnel who shared similar experiences of being dismissed or underestimated despite having valuable skills. Many of them worked in support roles that were considered less important than frontline positions. But Maria's story reminded everyone that every person in a military organization could potentially make a critical difference. The squadron's successful mission had broader strategic implications as well. The intelligence they had gathered and the targets they had neutralized significantly disrupted enemy operations in the region. Allied forces were able to advance more safely because of the squadron's work, which had only been possible because Maria had ensured they survived to complete their objectives. 6 months later, Maria received official notification that she was being promoted and transferred to the Strategic Planning Division. Her new role would involve analyzing complex operational scenarios and providing mathematical support for high-level mission planning. The non-essential classification had been permanently removed from her record. During the promotion ceremony, Colonel Harrison publicly acknowledged Maria's contribution to Operation Desert Wind. He explained how her discovery had prevented a catastrophic loss of life and emphasized that her example demonstrated the importance of every person's role in military operations. The applause from her colleagues was long and heartfelt. As Maria accepted her new responsibilities, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. The same attention to detail and methodical approach that had once made her seem slow and overly cautious were now recognized as essential qualities for critical analysis work. She had learned that being labeled non-essential often meant that people simply didn't understand the true value of what you had to offer. 5 years after Operation Desert Wind, Maria had become one of the most respected analysts in the Strategic Planning Division. Her reputation for catching critical errors and providing innovative solutions had spread throughout the military community. Young analysts sought her mentorship, and senior officers regularly requested her input on complex operations. The changes extended far beyond Maria's personal career. The near disaster she had prevented led to a complete overhaul of the military's navigation systems and quality control procedures. New protocols required multiple independent verification of flight vectors, and software updates were subjected to much more rigorous testing. The improvements had already prevented several other potential accidents. Maria established a training program for data analysts that emphasized the importance of trusting their instincts and speaking up when something seemed wrong. She taught her students that being thorough and methodical wasn't a weakness but a crucial strength that could save lives. The program became a model that was adopted by other military branches. Major Reynolds, who had been promoted to colonel, often spoke about Maria's contribution when addressing new pilot trainees. He explained how the person they might consider least important could turn out to be the one who saves their lives. His story became part of the standard curriculum for teaching teamwork and respect for all military personnel. The squadron members who had been saved by Maria's intervention remained in contact with her over the years. Many of them had gone on to distinguished careers, and they never forgot the debt they owed to her careful analysis and dedication. Captain Williams, now a major himself, named his daughter Maria in honor of the woman who had made her existence possible. Maria's story became a case study taught in military academies around the world. Leadership instructors used her experience to illustrate how traditional hierarchies and classification systems could blind organizations to hidden talent. The lesson was clear. Every person had potential value that might not be immediately apparent. The personal transformation was just as significant as the professional recognition. Maria had discovered confidence in her abilities that she never knew she possessed. She learned to speak up more assertively in meetings and to trust her analytical instincts even when others disagreed. The shy, overlooked analyst had become a respected leader. During a recent interview for a military journal, Maria reflected on what she had learned from her experience. She emphasized that being labeled non-essential had actually given her a unique perspective that proved valuable in a crisis. Sometimes being outside the main hierarchy allowed you to see problems that others missed. The memorial wall at the base now included a plaque commemorating Operation Desert Wind and recognizing the importance of thorough analysis and attention to detail in military operations. While it didn't mention Maria by name, everyone who knew the story understood what it represented. Small details could have enormous consequences. Maria continued to work quietly behind the scenes, analyzing data and solving problems that others couldn't crack. She had learned that true importance wasn't always reflected in official classifications or organizational charts. Sometimes the most essential people were those who worked diligently in the background, catching the errors and solving the problems that kept everything else running smoothly. The squadron she had saved continued to fly missions around the world, each pilot carrying with them the knowledge that their lives had once depended on the careful work of someone they had barely noticed. They had learned to respect every person who contributed to their missions, understanding that survival often depended on the dedication of people whose names might never appear in official reports. Years later, when young military personnel felt overlooked or undervalued, their supervisors would often tell them about Maria Santos and the night she stayed late to check some routine vector calculations. The story served as a reminder that everyone's work mattered, and that being classified as non-essential didn't mean you couldn't be the person who made all the difference when it counted most. Maria's legacy wasn't just in the lives she had saved, but in the culture change she had helped inspire throughout the military. Her example encouraged others to take pride in their attention to detail and to never hesitate to speak up when they noticed something that didn't seem right. Sometimes the smallest voice carried the most important message.